And I remember Richard saying to me, Eddie don't like me. He don't like me, he don't like me. And I was like, what do you mean he don't like you? That's, and so Richard said he don't like me. And I would show him different articles and here's things as Eddie's saying, and Richard would look at me like.
When comedy legend Richard Pryor passed away in 2005, many expected his protege and longtime admirer Eddie Murphy to be front and center at the funeral. But he wasn't there, and fans were left stunned. The absence of one of Pryor's closest comedic heirs raised eyebrows and sparked questions. Was it a snub, or was there something deeper behind Murphy's decision to stay away? Maybe you don't know Eddie Murphy's admiration for Richard Pryor began long before the world knew him as a comedy superstar. Growing up in the gritty streets of Brooklyn, New York, Murphy was drawn to Pryor's fearless, boundary-pushing approach to stand-up comedy. As a teenager, he would spend hours listening to Pryor's albums, particularly That Nigger's Crazy and Bicentennial Nigger, absorbing every cadence, pause, and inflection. It wasn't just the laugh that captivated him. It was the way Pryor infused raw honesty into his material, tackling subjects like race, poverty, and personal vulnerability while maintaining a razor-sharp sense of humor. Murphy later admitted that Pryor's work made him see comedy not simply as truth entertainment, but as a form of social telling. Pryor had demonstrated that a comedian could provoke thought, confronted hypocrisy, and yet still delivered gut-busting laughter, a combination Murphy found intoxicating. He mimicked Pryor's rhythms, studied his improvisational timing, and internalized the unflinching courage it took to speak openly about the human experience in a world that often preferred silence or polite avoidance. By the late 1970s, Murphy had honed his own voice on the New York stand-up circuit. His performances radiated confidence, charm, and irreverence, and audiences quickly recognized a spark that set him apart. When Murphy landed a spot on Saturday Night Live in 1980, he was only 19 years old, barely out of adolescence, but his talent was undeniable. Within months, he became the show's breakout star, redefining what a young black comedian could achieve on a national stage. His sketches, whether as Buckwheat, Mr. Robinson, or Gumby, showcased not only his mimicry skills, but also a fearless inventiveness that seemed to leap off the screen. Murphy's meteoric rise signaled a new era in comedy and Hollywood, one in which a young black performer could dominate both television and film at an unprecedented level. The film world soon followed. Murphy's first major motion picture, 48 Chasseurs, was a critical and commercial hit, demonstrating that he could carry a film with charisma, wit, and a raw edge. Trading Places cemented his ability to blend sharp social commentary with mass appeal humor, and Beverly Hills Cop turned him into the most bankable black actor in Hollywood almost overnight. Murphy's appeal was broad. He could make white audiences laugh as easily as black audiences, and his films had crossover success that had eluded most African-American actors before him. Meanwhile, Pryor, who had spent the 1970s breaking barriers in comedy and film, found his own box office successes like Stir Crazy, but he had never achieved the same level of dominance. In some ways, Murphy had realized the dream that Pryor had long chased, to become a cultural force and financial juggernaut while retaining comedic integrity. Initially, many fans and industry insiders assumed that Murphy's rise represented the natural continuation of Pryor's legacy, a torchbearer passing the flame to the next generation. But behind the scenes, the dynamic between the two comedians was more complicated. As Murphy's fame skyrocketed, whispers began circulating within Pryor's inner circle. Some interpreted Murphy's success as eclipsing Pryor's achievements, doing so in a way that was larger, cleaner, and more commercially palatable than Pryor's gritty, often chaotic style. Murphy was young, energetic, and seemingly unstoppable, a figure who could take the hard-won breakthroughs of the previous generation and amplify them exponentially. In this light, Pryor's admiration for Murphy gradually gave way to a wary sense of rivalry. Pryor had always been an artist who relished risk, both on stage and off, and watching a younger comedian achieve unprecedented acclaim in spaces he had fought to occupy stirred a mixture of pride, envy, and protectiveness. By the mid-1980s, the tension between admiration and rivalry became increasingly palpable. While Murphy publicly expressed his respect for Pryor, insiders suggest that Pryor privately wrestled with a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, there was recognition. Murphy was brilliant, talented, and, in many ways, Pryor's spiritual successor. On the other hand, there was a sense of displacement. The younger comic was reaping rewards, box office success, merchandising opportunities, and global fame that Pryor had struggled to attain despite his groundbreaking work. The notion that Murphy might be taking everything Richard had fought for became a recurring thought among Pryor's close associates, framing a silent competition that never fully erupted in public, but nonetheless shaped the narrative of both men's careers. By the mid-1980s, the trajectory of Eddie Murphy's career and Richard Pryor's life had begun to diverge in ways that would subtly, yet profoundly, shape their relationship. Pryor, who had spent the previous decade redefining American comedy, was facing the harsh realities of declining health. Diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, he was struggling physically, and the disease gradually took a toll on his energy, mobility, and ability to perform at the relentless pace that had characterized his earlier years. Concurrently, the film and comedy worlds were evolving rapidly, and Pryor, despite his legendary status, found his career momentum slowing. Offers were fewer, projects were riskier, and the industry that had once celebrated his daring social critiques and fearless humor was increasingly focused on the next wave of talent. Meanwhile, Eddie Murphy was ascending at a dizzying speed, capturing public attention in ways that even Pryor had not. Murphy's Saturday Night Live tenure had already made him a household name, but his dominance extended far beyond television. Films like 48 Hers, Trading Places, and Beverly Hills Cop had cemented him as Hollywood's most bankable black actor, and the success of his stand-up specials, Delirious and Raw, propelled him into a stratosphere few performers of any background could touch. Murphy was not just performing. He was commanding record-breaking salaries, selling out arenas, and becoming a cultural phenomenon whose influence extended across generations and continents. The contrast between his unstoppable rise and Pryor's slowing pace created a visible, almost symbolic tension between youth and experience, ambition and endurance. As mentioned, at first, Murphy had been candid in his admiration for Pryor. He often cited Pryor as a pivotal influence, praising the older comedian's fearlessness, timing, and the way he blended humor with incisive social critique. Yet, as Murphy's fame exploded, he became increasingly protective of his individuality. Journalists and interviewers frequently labeled him the next Richard Pryor, an association that Murphy found irksome. Fiercely proud and determined to carve his own identity, he began to distance himself from the comparison. In interviews, he was careful to clarify that Pryor had influenced him, but he was not his disciple, and certainly not an extension of Pryor's legacy. Pryor was an influence, not an idol, Murphy emphasized, drawing a line between respect and imitation, signaling that his success was his own. For Pryor, who had long grappled with the feeling that Hollywood often undervalued his contributions, Murphy's subtle distancing felt like more than a media strategy. It felt like a slight. Pryor had built a career through risk-taking, honesty, and vulnerability, often confronting societal taboos head-on, and he was deeply aware of the sacrifices required to reach such heights. The thought that a younger comedian could inherit or even surpass the public's adoration while refusing to fully align himself with Pryor's shadow reportedly stung. Within his inner circle, friends recounted that Pryor began to express frustration privately, feeling that the recognition he had fought for was being quietly redirected to Murphy without proper acknowledgement of the struggles behind it. The rift widened when Pryor allegedly began to critique Murphy behind closed doors. Friends claimed that he described Murphy as all flash, no soul, suggesting that while Murphy's performances dazzled audiences with technical brilliance and high-energy charisma, they lacked the vulnerability, honesty, and raw emotional truth that had been Pryor's hallmark. The unspoken implication was that Murphy could entertain millions, but had not yet confronted the deeper human truths that Pryor had always embraced in his work. In turn, Murphy's public insistence on maintaining autonomy and distancing himself from Pryor's legacy may have inadvertently reinforced this perception. Not long after, the feud, while rooted in professional rivalry, soon spilled into the personal realm, transforming what might have been a generational passing of the torch into a delicate, often uncomfortable standoff. The dynamics of fame, legacy, and creative ownership were complicated by ego, health struggles, and the high stakes of Hollywood success, creating an environment in which every public statement, every offhand remark, and every performance could be interpreted as a provocation or a challenge. According to Jennifer Lee Pryor, Richard Pryor's ex-wife, the two men's relationship was fraught with jealousy and harsh words. Pryor, who had spent years breaking barriers for black comedians and redefining what stand-up could achieve, reportedly bristled at Murphy's meteoric rise, especially when it seemed that Murphy was hesitant to fully acknowledge Pryor's pioneering role. In Pryor's eyes, Murphy's refusal to constantly credit him as a trailblazer was a subtle form of disrespect, a minimization of the risks, sacrifices, and raw honesty that had defined Pryor's career. For Murphy, however, the criticism worked in reverse. Fiercely protective of his individuality, he perceived Pryor's remarks and private critiques as attempts to undermine his accomplishments. The young comedian, now commanding record-breaking salaries and stadium-sized audiences, bristled at the suggestion that his achievements were somehow lesser because they differed in style or tone from Pryor's grittier, more visceral approach. One story, often recounted in interviews and biographies, illustrates the strained personal dynamic. It is said that Murphy, in an effort to bridge the gap, once sought to reconcile, reaching out to Pryor in a gesture of professional and personal respect. According to the accounts, Pryor brushed him off, allegedly remarking bluntly that he was unimpressed by Murphy's polished, Hollywood-friendly style. Whether or not the story is fully accurate, it captured the essence of the tension between them, a clash not only of talent, but of philosophy. Pryor's comedy had always leaned into vulnerability, exposing personal pain, social inequities, and the unvarnished truths of human experience. Murphy, by contrast, blended fearlessness with star-quality charm and mainstream accessibility, appealing to audiences across racial and cultural lines while rarely delving into the same raw personal confessions that had defined Pryor's stage persona. The perceived snubs and criticisms extended beyond private conversations into the public arena. Murphy, never one to shy away from pointed humor, began weaving subtle jabs into his performances. In Raw, 1987, widely regarded as a landmark in stand-up comedy, Murphy recounted advice supposedly given by Pryor on dealing with hecklers, framing it in a way that painted Pryor as slightly out of touch with the brash, boundary-pushing style that Murphy had mastered. Audiences laughed uproariously, oblivious to the subtext, but those close to the comedians recognized the underlying message. Murphy was asserting his own dominance while simultaneously responding to the older comic's critiques. It was a clever, if cutting, maneuver. Humor as both shield and weapon, a tactic Murphy had honed since his earliest days in comedy. Behind the curtain, Pryor's response was said to be quietly scathing. Friends and insiders recalled Pryor expressing frustration at the younger comedian's success and his willingness to publicly push back, suggesting that Murphy's rise had been achieved at the expense of a certain level of respect that Pryor felt he deserved. In essence, the feud became a complex interplay of admiration, rivalry, and wounded pride. Murphy owed much of his comedic DNA to Pryor, yet he had emerged as a superstar in a way that seemed, at least to Pryor and some close associates, to overshadow the man who had paved the way. At its peak, when Richard Pryor died in December 2005, the outpouring of grief was immediate and immense. Comedians across the spectrum, from Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock to Whoopi Goldberg and countless others, publicly honored Pryor's life and work, recalling not only his genius, but the courage it had taken to perform in a world that had often resisted black voices. Pryor's death was a cultural moment, a recognition of the profound impact he had on comedy, film, and American society. Yet Eddie Murphy, whose career had been inextricably shaped by Pryor's influence, remained conspicuously silent. He did not attend the funeral. He offered no public statement, no tribute, no acknowledgement beyond private circles, if indeed any was made at all. Murphy's silence was widely debated and scrutinized. Some argued that he was simply a private man who grieved without fanfare, unwilling to turn mourning into a media spectacle. To those who knew Murphy's personality, this explanation seemed plausible. He had long preferred to control his public narrative and had often guarded his private life with care. Yet others, aware of the decades-long tension between the two comedians, interpreted Murphy's absence as a reflection of the unresolved animosity that had shadowed their relationship. To show up at the funeral might have felt, to Murphy, disingenuous, a public display of respect that belied the bitterness, jealousy, and personal slights that had defined much of their connection. Among Pryor's loyalists, Murphy's silence only reinforced the perception of a feud that had never truly healed. Conversations among comedians and industry insiders often framed Murphy's absence as emblematic of the complicated, sometimes contradictory nature of human relationships, particularly in the glare of fame. What do you think about Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor's relationship? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.